Hey, welcome to episode 100 of the Hangar Z Podcast, brought to you by Vertical Valor Magazine. Man, it feels really good to announce episode 100, and it's hard to believe we've released 100 episodes to date. One thing that's been constant for the Hangar Z Podcast, as we've grown over the last 3 years, and 100 episodes is change. We've constantly worked to bring new and different types of interviews to our aviation community. Our hope in doing so is that our guest stories will challenge you, motivate you, and work to strengthen our global public safety aviation community. The guests we have in store for our 100th episode will definitely challenge and motivate you. This is part one of a two-part series. During the Hangar Z Leadership Summit 2023, Jack Schonely introduced me to the book titled Touching the Dragon by Jimmy Hatch. After the Leadership Summit, I bought the book and I couldn't put it down. Jimmy's story is truly inspiring. Jimmy's a former Navy SEAL, master naval parachutist. He was involved in over 150 missions between Afghanistan, Iraq, Bosnia, and Africa. Jimmy was also an expert canine trainer and handler as a Navy SEAL. Jimmy writes about the battles he fought overseas, as well as the battles he fought on the home front after being critically wounded while attempting to rescue Army deserter Private Bo Bergdahl. In Jimmy Hatch's book, Touching the Dragon, as well as in our conversation, Hatch courageously discusses the ever-important topic of PTSD by opening up about his own battle as he worked to heal from the career-ending gunshot wound that exploded through his femur, requiring 18 surgeries and 12 months of recovery, in which he had to relearn how to walk. Jimmy talks about the nonprofit canine organization he developed to protect our nation's working dogs called Spike's Canine Fund. As a canine handler on several deployments, James' life was regularly spared by the work of canines. One of the most memorable was Spike. And on James' final deployment, the night he was critically wounded, a canine Remco spared James' life while losing his own. From that evening on, James oriented his life around the training, care, and preservation of working dogs. In addition to working as the founder and president of the fund, he works with local law enforcement to fine-tune their work. If you're like me and listen to podcasts in the car, oftentimes with kids present, this may be one of the episodes you excuse them from. Thank you for joining us for the last 100 episodes. We look forward to continuing to bring inspiring stories and conversations like the one you'll hear here with Jack Schonely and Jimmy Hatch. I'd like to thank our sponsors, Metro Aviation, Shotover, and CNC Technologies. Hey, welcome to the Hangar Z Podcast. I'm your host, John Gray. Man, today is probably one of the most anticipated episodes that we've ever recorded. This for a lot of reasons. One, this is intended to be our 100th episode that Hangar Z Podcast is recorded and released, which is a big deal, being that when I started the podcast, I didn't know how far we'd ever get and who would listen. But, having all the folks that we've had on the podcast has been the backbone of what we've done. And because of folks like Jack, who's actually co-hosting the episode with us today.
Hey,
Jack.
You guys. Thanks for having me as the co-host.
Yeah.
I'm honored.
Yeah. But because of people like you, the podcast has grown. And really, it's the stories, that people like you are telling about the career and the adversity that we've faced in those careers that makes these podcast episodes interesting. So, through all these episodes, the one thing that has developed is the friendships with people like Jack and Jimmy, who I'm going to introduce you to shortly. The stories, are intended to be educational, inspiring, hopefully. And in this case, I want to bring on Jimmy Hatch, he wrote a book, probably the best book that I've ever read about his time as a Navy SEAL. I've read quite a few books written by SEALs, and they're all great books, and they tell stories that, I had no perspective on. I wasn't in the military, wasn't deployed overseas, and didn't understand that world. So to get some insight on what they experienced overseas was really cool. But Jimmy, your book was something else. The way you write, the way you include emotion in your writing really drew me into the book. I actually read it when I was on vacation in Hawaii. And of all places, I just couldn't put it down. So, we're on the beach in Hawaii, and my wife's like, "You want to go swimming?" I'm like, I'm almost done. Let me finish reading this chapter.
Thanks,
on that, let me back up to our Leadership Summit episode that was in January of 23. Jack was a guest on that episode. And during that conversation, you had brought up the book that Jimmy wrote, Touching the Dragon. And after that conversation, I went out and bought the book and read it. And then through the course of conversation, the idea came to approach Jimmy and see if he'd join us on the podcast to tell a story. And, just like my apprehensiveness to contact Jack, because I thought he'd say no, I was a little bit scared to ask Jimmy if he'd join us, but he agreed to. So, man, I'm really thankful. You've got a really interesting story, an accomplished background. And I think about, then I'll jump forward a little bit. When I was thinking about drink of the day today, there's I think it's Dos Equis, the most interesting man in the world. Those commercials, have you guys seen those? I'm thinking I should probably drink one of those beers today because I'm talking to Jimmy.
That's good.
But, but I didn't, and I'll circle back to the drink of the day here in a minute, but let me introduce you to Jimmy Hatch. Jimmy, thank you for joining us on the podcast, and man, I'm just honored to have you here to talk to us.
Thanks for having me, John. It's a good opportunity, and anytime I can hang out with Jack when Hags isn't around,
that's very true. This is much safer.
He's like a fungus. You have to get like sterilized after you're around him. It's unbecoming.
That's funny. Jack, do you care to elaborate on that?
He's absolutely right. That's how Jimmy and I met, is through this mutual friend. We have other mutual friends as well, what we'll get to, but Jim Haggerty was somebody I worked with in LA. He was a classmate. I've known him since 1983, and he's crazy and fun and funny, but really knows his stuff. He's the guy you want next to you in a fight. I've been there. We worked Canine together, and then he left the department. He ended up with the teams with Jimmy.
Yeah, he was my instructor, my trainer. Like, he taught me, like, when he earned his paycheck.
Yeah.
Well, just a satellite view of your guys' career. And Jack, I'll start with you. Jack, you were with LAPD for
31 years.
31 years. Canine operator, pilot, TFO, worked a beat for a long time, a ton of experience with LAPD, and he teaches the Apprehending Fleeing Suspects course, wrote the Apprehending Fleeing Suspects book. So wealth of knowledge. I think everybody on the podcast is probably familiar with you. So again, really happy to have you here. And Jimmy, for you, man, you're a Navy SEAL. That's I'm sure a big part of the story that we'll go through. You're currently at Yale. You're a brain amongst everything else. You in the SEALs, you were a canine operator. You were a skydiver, just a traditional operator. If I'm correct in saying that.
Yeah. Hey, but just so you know, man, being smart is important at Yale, but diversity is also important. And there's not a whole lot of 56-year-old white dudes with bullet holes in them. So don't give me so much credit about the brain thing, because I'll tell you what, I got a C- in my math class and I threw a freaking party.
I'd be throwing that party too. That's good stuff. Congratulations.
C's get degrees. You're good.
These kids are not messing around. Seriously, it's amazing. But yeah, don't think because I might even have a diploma, maybe. You might say Yale on it. It might look really cool, but I'm cut from a different cloth than those kids, man. Look, I am smart enough to know what I don't.
Ooh, that's good.
Well, I'm almost there. But wow, there are some people in this world that are incredibly gifted. It's really it's a great thing to be around. It really is.
Yeah, I think a lot of times we look at the youth of our country and you're like, what's going on here? But then you don't see like what you're talking about. And I think if you spend a little bit of time on those campuses, it's probably rejuvenating, to see where the future of our country is.
100%. I tell people all the time, look, I'm supposed to be the old white guy on a couch watching Fox News, all pissed off. Can't do it, man. I'm in these classes with these kids. I'm listening to them. I'm watching their work ethic. You don't see those kids with this. They do their homework and they all have these, but they're not. They're definitely different. And I talk to like the people that I socialize with, and I'm like, yeah, man, these kids don't do that. I mean, they have Facebook accounts, but they don't. They're very rarely on there. Like they don't. They definitely know how to manage their time better than I did when I was 20 years old.
Yeah, it's wild. Well, I guess drink of the day isn't probably a thing at Yale, or at least it's not as much as it is in other places.
Could be. Skydiving wasn't either, and I took 6 of my classmates skydiving. Nice. So
that's cool. Well, for drink of the day, as I kind of alluded to earlier, it's not a Dos Equis most interesting man in the world drink. It's probably, in fact, the exact opposite of that. It's It's a sparkling water. Jeff's not here, and Jimmy. Jeff's always got the water in hand, so this is another episode where I've got the sparkling water in hand. I said as a kid and as an adult too that sparkling water tastes like TV static, and for some reason, as I've gotten older, I feel like it tastes better for some reason. I guess that's just a function of being old, but that's what I've got for today. I'll pass it on to you, Jimmy. What's your drink of the day?
Yeah, I'm going with you. I'm addicted to the Perrier.
All right.
I was a little kid growing up in a trailer park in Utah. I went to the state fair and in like 1975 or something, and they had a table with Perrier out, in little plastic cups, and I drank. I'm like, oh, because the carbonation just got a little bite to it, And I was like, that's the best stuff ever. Of course, my parents were like, you're not drinking fucking Perrier. So, you know what I mean? I'm like, fuck, right? So as I got older, I got way into it. But yeah.
I like it.
Well,
Jack,
I'm
what are you
usually
drinking?
the water guy too with Jeff, but for Jimmy, I have to do something different. So I went with a Boneyard. Boneyard is a brewery here in Bend, and their number one seller is RPM. So Boneyard RPM for me.
Nice.
All right.
Nice.
Cheers, boys.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Jimmy, would you consider yourself a beer drinker or more of like a spirits drinker?
I guess I'm any of it really. I would say if I was just like, just grab I like Coors Light. You know what I mean? I like Coors, and I like wine too, and I like, I pretty much like it all. But if anything,
yeah, the puppers.
She's tired, man. She was out at the lake today. We were out working out there, and she was out swimming, chasing stick. She was in heaven. Yeah, I love her. She's 12 now, so she's been going to class with me, and she's flown across, jumped out of the plane with me. She's
a good-looking pup.
That's cool. Offline, we were talking a little bit about what you're doing, where you're at. Can you talk about that a little bit, just because it's interesting given what's happening right now?
Yeah, so I actually, I'll start class next week, but we had this course set up where Spike's Canine Fund helps to fund some of the participants in this particular class, which is a search and rescue human remains course. So the human remains detection dogs. And I didn't know this, but SAR canine teams are entirely self-funded unless they actually get to a point where they are so qualified that they can work for FEMA and go to like on deployments to like Maui, right? And then they get per diem while they're there, but they don't get any money to help them train the dog. They don't get any money to help take care of the dog. They don't.
Wow.
So, and given the amount of work that those dogs have done just in the last few years, I was like, we got to help those people because those dogs need. I mean, they're like the dogs in Maui right now are really hurting because of their feet. Like they're wearing bandages, they're wearing booties, and they're still getting hurt. So, there's a lot of things in that environment that we could work on that, where the dogs could have better lives, could do their jobs more efficiently, safer. We just need to get in there more and learn more about it. And it's a hard group to kind of get into. They're pretty uptight people. But, so what we're doing here this week is the woman who runs, it's an organization called, man, you should really actually have her on, Center for Forensic Training and Education. And they are, basically, she's one of the very few people in this country that can go to a place and check out a whole cadaver. So like you remember, Jack, when you were teaching dogs about explosive detection, we're working on, this, blasting caps and a little bit of det cord or whatever. But when we get to Iraq and there's a whole truckload of shit on the side of the road, that's overwhelming to the dog. They're like, what the? So they may not react the way we're accustomed to it, right? So most of the search and rescue people across the country can get like a placenta, or they can get people's like molars, wisdom teeth when they're pulled, or, that don't really have degrading body material in a big scent package. So that's what they do here. So she, like today, she had a fire department guy who's on the task force with her. He met us, and he has a tree business, so he's got a backhoe. So believe me, when he brings his backhoe, it takes us a lot less time. We don't have to dig. But so she'll take a body and she'll bury one in a shallow grave, like a quick crime thing, and then she'll bury another one standard depth. And it's really one of the few places in the country where they can get that level of immersion in what it's like to find a real body. And It's beautiful, man, to watch. When you see these dogs up on these boats, like they're just standing on the boat, like, and they'll take you right where you need to go. And the dog will sit down and say, okay, this is where the body is. And man, one of the dogs that was he's my favorite. His name is Bax. He's in Maui right now, but he did this course a couple of years ago and then went home. They're based in Seattle. And he was sent out to find a guy who fell overboard in his fishing boat. And he was in 35 feet of water in the Sound, and the dog found him. And that's cool. It's just a dead guy, but
that's huge
family
to the family.
What I mean?
Yeah.
And timely.
Yeah.
So
it's
not weeks and weeks and months, and somebody finds something. No, it's today.
Yeah.
Take a dog to the vicinity, and man, it's amazing.
Yeah, it is, and it's cool to be involved with. It's good for my heart. It's good for my soul to see, and I'm just grateful that we have people who support our mission. Like, it's funny when I talk to my classmates. I'm like, can't run a nonprofit and be a socialist. You just if people didn't have discretionary income that they could make their own choices with, if they didn't have, we'd be like the rest of the world. You know what I mean? And I get not letters. I get emails from people in Germany, the UK, other countries saying, hey, can you help us with our dogs? Because it's illegal in this country to donate to the police department.
Wow. This is, I think, a good point. I intended to talk about this later. We'll talk about the genesis of Spikes later. But can you talk about Spikes and what you're doing with your nonprofit and what that looks like? Yeah.
So I came back. Spike was my first working dog. He was killed in 2006. And it was a shoot through. So basically we were hitting a target and a guy squirted. We gave him the warnings and all that bullshit. Sent the dog hit him, knocked him down. The guy had a big cloak on. It was December, right? Christmas Eve-ish. And so the Spike hit him up high and he flipped under because of the jacket, turned around, hit the ground, turned around, came back, hit the guy up high like this. The guy took him to the ground. So I ran over and the guy was trying to hurt him. So I put some bullets into him, and one of the bullets went through and hit Spike. And I didn't know it at the time, but the guy rolled off, and I saw Spike, and he was kind of stumbling around. I said to the guy next to me, I'm like, man, he fucking broke his leg. And he goes, no, man, he's hurt. And so we took care of the person, and then I grabbed Spike, and I could tell he wasn't breathing right. I threw him up over my shoulder, and I ran back to the, kind of where we had started the whole thing, and the medic was there, PJ, and he's like, there's really nothing I can do now, man. He's gone. It blew one of his lungs out. So it was really hard for me, and I didn't really deal with it. And it's one of the things after the rest of my career unfolded, and, I ended up getting hurt and, spending time in the hospital for, gunshot wound and all that stuff. The mental health stuff really kicked in. So I didn't really deal with that. Hey, I got an important job. It's great. Law enforcement, aviation, and, special operations in the military, you always have an excuse to not address things because you're busy and your job's very important. And if you don't train, you're going to get, you know what I mean? You're letting your buddies down, and it's so easy to find a reason to not, deal with your own mental health issues. So anyway, I didn't deal with them. After I got hurt, I really struggled. I ended up having to process the stuff that happened with Spike and other things that were difficult that occurred, during my time when I was deploying. And then, once I got out of my mental health journey and got myself to a place where I could actually be a contributor to society again, I didn't know what to do. And I called the police that had come to my home the night I was suicidal and, basically wanted them to kill me. I went to their canine guys and said, hey, man, my name's Jimmy Hatch, and I've done some good work with dogs overseas. They're like, yeah, we know who you are. And yeah, for sure, we could use your help. They didn't need my help, but they knew I was a guy that needed somebody to put their arm around him and say, hey, man, you're part of the crew. Thank you. I really needed that. That's my whole life. I'd lived in that environment, and I didn't realize how important that was to me. You kind of play those, you play that stuff off, and then it's gone, and you're like, oh, wait a minute. What was, it's tough. That transition's tough. At any rate, while I was helping those guys out, one of the dogs got hurt, and he needed a surgery, and the city was like, yeah, we don't think it's worth it. So I was shocked, actually, and this dog had done some things for the community. It's not like he was just a dog that sat in the kennel and went out in the car one time. This dog had been chased down guys shooting at him, had been in houses where this old grandma lady said, hey, there's somebody in my house. And, the guys go over and they're like, they walk through the house like, ma'am, there's nobody here. And she's like, I'm telling you, there's somebody in my house. They're like, would you like us to get the dog? And she's like, yes, I would. And the dog comes over and sure enough, runs upstairs into her closet. Some dude's buried under a pile of clothes. It was that same dog, and the city didn't want to help him. So I couldn't believe it, I couldn't believe it. So I took a picture of me and Spike. It's on the cover of the the book.
I just might have that.
I went to a guy who's there you go. I went to a friend of mine who's a really, really, really good photographer, and he's also good at Photoshop, and he helped me make that logo. And each one of those stars in the logo represents a dog with whom I worked that was killed in combat. And I just don't ever want to forget those dogs. And I talked a little bit about my mental health struggles, and the law enforcement folks that got involved with me, they changed everything for me. I mean, they changed my whole trajectory. So I made this little quote: never underestimate your ability to affect the trajectory of another human life, especially at their most vulnerable moments. And I think that's important in our environments, whether it's aviation, where law enforcement, special, whatever, wherever the punishment for poor choices is generally death or harm, right? Those environments are where it's the toughest for people to accept that they're a human being, right? Because we expect ourselves to be superhuman, turns out.
We talked about this yesterday, John and I. We talked about your situation with those officers that came to you in your time of at your lowest moment and said, what if those two guys aren't compassionate? What if those two guys are just, whatever, they're just not, they weren't into it. Those two guys wanted to help you and did help you. And now they find out, and what John and I talked about is, think how many people in patrol you had contact with. You never knew if you had an impact on them or not. Maybe you did, maybe you didn't. Right. And it depends on what your attitude was too. Maybe you had a negative impact, but those two had an amazing impact that allows us to sit here and talk to you today about Spike's Canine Fund and a lot of other good things. So it's amazing the impact that a patrol officer can have on somebody, and you just don't realize it. Every patrol officer needs to hear that. That line you just used, every patrol officer needs to remember that, because they have dozens of contacts a day, and some of them are, not big nothings. Some of them change people's lives. You're an example.
Yeah. I think there's a propensity as a patrol officer. You go to so many calls throughout the course of your day, and over the course of your career, you have this propensity to be like, this is a bullshit call. I'm not going to put any effort into it. And you kind of, at the beginning of these calls, you make those decisions pretty quickly, and you have to realize sometimes that's not the case. We don't often, like Jack said, get to look back and see what we did and how we changed someone's life. But you're a perfect example of how a good officer impacted you, and then you went on to impact hundreds of thousands of people, literally, through your book, through your speeches, through Spikes. And that's all because of all these things coming together. So that's huge.
Yeah. And those guys, we can share, authorship in people's lives, and not a lot of people, and look, you guys, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but it's not an easy time to be a police officer. And I think it is important that I go out of my way when I'm around law enforcement people to say, hey man, thank you. And that's not something that people are accustomed to. And I get it. I get it. My CEO, Emily Gray, who is, she's amazing. She tracked down those officers, and she had them at a country club, a yacht club in Virginia Beach. I gave a speech for a big fundraiser, and Anderson Cooper was there, and some other, some pretty big time donors. And I tell the story, and Emily didn't tell me those guys were here. They were sitting at the front with their wives. After I met those guys, she told me, and it was interesting because Anderson Cooper was there. We watched the whole thing, and he was touched. It was touching, and I just gave him a hug. I was teared up, and I said, thanks, you guys. I was embarrassed. I would never have done that on my own, but for them to be able to sit there and hear that makes me really happy. It's like when I went to the, the guys up at Travis or Fort Lewis, when I got to go to their formal and tell that story to their whole family, it's hard to beat that. Those people people need to hear that kind of shit.
Absolutely. Let me ask you, that could have easily, based on what I've read and heard and talked to you, that could have easily gone the other way that night. Correct?
I was trying to mud suck them.
Yeah.
If they would have acted cocky, honestly, I was hoping that's what I was like in my sickness. I was drunk. I was fucked up drunk. And I was like, these guys are going to show up and they're going to be cocky. And I fucking like violence.
Here we go. Yeah.
I'm so glad it didn't go the other way.
Us too.
Yeah.
But it's funny, when I've gone out and helped different departments, sometimes I'll help out with the SWAT guys or sometimes just with the dogs. I always ask them, hey, what's your greatest fear? And most of them say, hey, a guy like you going sideways. Like, that makes sense,
But they were pros.
What I've also found is that there are issues in law enforcement, the mental health issues in law enforcement aren't really all that different from those in special operations world. You know, it's the same. It's in the same tube, you know, somewhere.
Yeah, I feel like because, and we talked a little bit about this offline, but because we do what we do, there's this understanding or this thought process that takes place that I should expect to deal with these traumatic incidents or occurrences because I signed up for it, and because I signed up for it, I've got to be okay with the outcome of it. I shouldn't have to, you know, take time out of my day to go see a counselor or to deal with it. And that's the exact opposite of what we need to do, you know? So again, my hope in talking to you and going through your story is to inspire folks to look at themselves and say, what can I do to get to the other side of this career and walk out healthy and happy, you know? And it's not happening enough. And your story is super inspiring. You've overcome a lot of adversity to become who you are professionally, and then, you know, mentally and physically and everything else. And to get there, maybe we could just start with, you know, how you even at a young age decided to go into the military and what inspired you to do that.
Yeah, man. So I talked a little bit about my background. The people who raised me, you know, like I said, I was adopted a couple of times, and those parents were divorced and remarried, and I ran away and ended up living in different places. I was not an easy kid, but one thing I did learn in that environment is that relationships are transactional. Whether or not that's how we want them to be or not, it didn't matter to me. I was very practical, and I realized if I'm good, I don't get beat or I get to eat. If I'm bad, I get a beating and I don't get to eat, right? Like, so to me, the military was a place that I could easily understand. And I knew that if I showed up there and I worked my ass off, and I'd done so much reading as a kid about war that I knew if I was in a special group and I worked my ass off, that I'd be well taken care of and I'd get to be around people that wanted to be there and valued that environment as well. And so, you know, again, growing up, I was born in the 60s, growing up in the 70s, John Wayne's a fucking Green Beret, and I wanted to be a Green Beret, you know? So that's what I read about. And, you know, coming after Vietnam, it's not unlike the stuff after the Bin Laden mission. Everybody wants to know about the Navy SEALs. It was the same thing after Vietnam. Green Berets were it's a huge story. And that's all most of the kids that I grew up with ever wanted to be was a Green Beret. So I went to the Army National Guard Reserves. I enlisted as a junior in high school. They sent me to boot camp at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, and then jump school at Fort Benning. Then I went back to finish my senior year, which I just dropped out and took a GED. But when I was at jump school, my company commander was a Ranger, an Army captain, and he's a badass. To a kid like me, 17 years old from Utah, that had read war books his whole life, and now I'm running next to an Army Ranger. You know what I mean? Like, and I was a fast runner, and I was the guidon bearer. And so he would grab me and say, "Come on, Hatch," because I could run. And there's one big hill there, Heart Attack Hill or some shit, I can't remember. And he would like try to push me up it, and I could outrun him. But it was fun. I wouldn't pass him. And anyway, one day he said, "You know what, Hatch? Sometimes there's these guys that come through here, just a few of them. They're small groups, and they're kind of crazy like you." And I said, "Who's that?" And he said, "Well, they're called SEALs." And I said, "What the hell is that?" He's like, "Well, it's like a special unit from the Navy." And I'm like, So I get done with jump school. I go home. I go to the library on account of we didn't have the internet, right? And I open up the encyclopedia, Navy SEAL, and there's a dude standing on a beach with a machine gun, and I'm like, I have to do that.
Yes, please.
So that's the long and short of it, really. It took me a while. I went to Buds twice. First time I quit, I didn't have a lot of confidence, and the biggest guy in our class got up and quit. And I was like, holy shit, man. If that guy doesn't have any business here, I sure as hell ain't got any business here. It was like me and like 5 other dudes, you know. In an hour, we're like, what the fuck were we thinking? You know? But the Navy saw fit to send me to the fleet, which is, you know, ships. And a ship is like jail, except you can drown. And I don't know why anybody would ever go on a cruise. Cruise is a petri dish. It's going to break. People are going to be sick and fall off. I don't know, man. I just don't know why people do it. So, anyway, I went to the fleet and got my ass kicked for being a quitter. And I went back to SEAL training.
What kind of swimmer were you, Jimmy? Before Buds, what kind of swimmer were you? Nothing?
Nah. I was in kindergarten, and I watched him pull a friend of mine out of a canal, drown. kid, he's my best friend. And so I was always a little bit scared, I'll tell you what, when they tie your hands and feet, when they tie your hands behind your back and tie your feet and put you in that pool, boy, you're going to come to a moment.
Where's that bell?
It's cool, man, because they could take a guy, like me. And actually it was interesting they're always trying to figure out, what is the secret to getting people through SEAL training. And so they've done a bunch of research, and one chunk they did was on the sports that, the students, the candidates in SEAL training, the sports they played, and what, they were trying to figure out which sports generally were associated with success at SEAL training. And I was shocked at the sport that proved to be the most significant for getting people through SEAL training. It was wrestlers.
That's interesting.
And almost I'd say at least half of the dudes I know in the SEAL teams come from either Pennsylvania or Ohio, and they're all wrestlers.
A lot of wrestling in Pennsylvania or Ohio.
And it's really interesting. And I asked my buddies, I'm like, why is wrestling like? Because it sucks. You can't eat.
They're always cutting weight. They're never eating.
I would have thought it was swimming.
I would have guessed swimming too.
Yeah, you think swimming or running, but when you think about it, my boys wrestled. I didn't wrestle, and I wish I would have now, because that's one of those sports. It teaches you a lot about yourself. What you put into it is what you get out of it. And you notice that if you're winning matches, it's because you're putting work in. If you're losing, it's most often because you're not putting the work in.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
And the conditioning that is required for that sport is insane. My boys, they love wrestling, but they hated the conditioning, and they didn't realize that you've got to have one to get the other, so it makes sense. But going back, you talked a little bit about your desire to join the military, and in the book, you wrote a little bit about it. And one of the things that I think about with public safety in the military, I think we all generally we generally want to do something bigger than ourselves, which is kind of the first component of wanting to be in a program like that. But then the second part of that is looking at the person to the right and left of you. Like those people, we've formed bonds with these people that you can't get anywhere else. The adversity that we've faced with these folks, the just crappy situations we've been in with them, there's no way to replicate that outside of what we do. So I love that about you writing in that book, how you kind of sought that. I thought was a really good point, and allowed me to reflect on my desire for those things. So again, your writing in that was really well done. I don't know if you want to touch on that at all, Jimmy, that now that we're kind of there.
There's something else I want to say. I just I'm not comfortable saying it. But look, I guess probably 18 months ago or so, I went and did plant medicine down in Mexico. And it's something that a lot of the guys from my former life and the Army guys in a similar unit have gone to Mexico and done these they're psychedelics. And when people started talking to me about it, I'm like, yeah, whatever. Patchouli, poor hygiene, fuck all that. I don't want any part of that, right? But I was mistaken. And it was one of the most powerful experiences of my life, and certainly the most helpful mental health modality I have had any experience with ever, without a doubt. Nothing's even close. But what happened after that was I was there with 4 other guys from my former life and then a professional athlete. And we did 2 types of medicine. So you get there on a Friday and you stay Saturday, Sunday, you go back on Monday. And we started talking after we had done the plant medicine, which it puts you in a state where you're kind of humble because you kind of see who you really are and what you really are. And it's actually the first time in my life I actually loved myself, truthfully, seriously. But here's where this is hard. A lot of people, myself included, a lot of people find their way into the type of work I do and what you guys have done because they come from an environment where they were fucking brutalized, and they want to make sure that they don't allow that to happen. They will protect people who can't protect themselves. I would be willing to bet at least 2/3. This is a totally wild guess, but I would say at least 2/3 of my buddies in my former line of work were people who had some brutal things happen to them as a child. And I think I heard a guy, he was actually an assistant chief police officer in Indianapolis. This is probably 10 years ago. He said, look, man, you take people like yourself, and he was talking to me, people who have traumatic experiences as a kid, and they're trying to fix it, because that's really kind of one of the things that we're trying to do. Like, I don't want that shit to happen to somebody. I was a child and people were brutal to me, and I'm not, believe me, I did a podcast with a couple of my classmates at Yale, and I said, who's easy to kill? And they're not used to hearing shit like that, He said, you know who's easy to kill? The guys who spray little girls in the face with acid, blind them, and disfigure them for going to school, right? So that kind of stuff, there's a different click switch in me for that kind of shit. And I was super aggressive. And I believe that there's something to do with people's family life as a child that plays into people getting into this kind of work. I do believe that, and it's a hard thing to talk about. But let me just leave you with this one last comment on that. The smartest person I know, smartest human I have ever met by far, not even close. She's the dean of arts and sciences at Yale. Her name's Tamar Gendler. She's a philosophy and math or cognitive scientist. I mean, she's just incredible. And she said, you know, look, the Spartans figured that out a long time ago. If you abuse children, they'll be really good fighters. And that's the truth. And there's something, you know, there's a reason a guy will stick his neck out for a complete stranger who's being brutalized. There's a reason a guy will do that. You know, I've sat in classrooms with kids and they're like, I would never die for, and I say, well, I would be sad to live a life where I didn't have something I would die for, you know? And I think that when guys go through really traumatic stuff, I think it gives you that capacity, and that can be guided and it can be misguided. I think that that's something that we need to, we just need to crack that door a little bit more. Mm-hmm. I think there's a lot more to it than what's being discussed.
Yeah.
Particularly with the military and the law enforcement. I don't know if the SAR people are, they're just fucked up.
That's a really interesting perspective right there. That's interesting. Very interesting to me. I'm not surprised to hear that. Because I know that, well, some of those people that get abused, they end up being serial killers too, you know? So it's like, what takes you across that line as opposed to the good and the bad and going bad? You know, that would be a really interesting place to go to figure out. Well, maybe you haven't thought about that. Why did you end up, and others, you know, end up like all of us, but you in particular, why do you end up going the good side where you're fighting for good, and that evil guy, I got no problem whacking him. I mean, as opposed to being one of the bad people.
Yeah, I remember, and I think it's in the book where I talk about, I'm in the Death Star, which is that big, you know, intel center. They're got the video up, you know, live feed of motherfuckers getting blown up in a ditch by a AC-130 gunship. And I'm like, man, I got more in common with those dudes getting blown up in the ditch than I do with these people in here. You know what I mean? Like there's definitely a couple of different parts of the military, just like there is in law enforcement as well. You know, there's the kind of shiny parts, and then there's the parts that get shit done, you know. And I think the parts that get shit done, you know, nobody likes to see how the sausage is made and it's not pretty. And, you know, but I think if you've been brutalized as a kid and you come up in that environment, it's not hard.
Understood.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think, you know, there's a desire to be loved.
Yeah.
And I think that's not something to be poo-pooed, you know?
Yeah, I think that speaks to the bonds that are forged in our industries. You know, just like I said, you can't build those in the same way anywhere else. It's really, and if you can, it's really hard to do. You know, but you talked about buds a little bit, and you know, with I think every book that I've read and every story about a SEAL goes through buds. So I think most of our listeners understand how hard buds is and what's involved. I'd like to hear kind of the lighter side of buds. When you think through your experience,
is there a lighter side of buds?
There is for sure. And I remember the instructor saying, "You look, man, you ain't gonna be able to laugh about any of this shit for a while, but when you do, it's gonna be good." So, and it's brutal, man. Like I was talking to a friend of mine not too long ago who's an instructor, and he's like, "Jimmy, I just can't believe we put ourselves through this shit." He's like, as an instructor to sit and watch this is like, fuck, man. But I think one of the things about SEAL training that is often overlooked is the funny ways in which you get things done. Like you learn relatively quickly that you're never going to be able to do everything, and you have to pick and choose what's important and what's going to get you punished, right? And safety stuff is always the most important thing, right? But I think you learn things there about each other that aren't part of the planned curriculum, right? And so you learn to see who's quick on their feet, who will bend the rules a little bit, who's not afraid to say, fuck this, man, I'm going to go out and get it done, and everybody just be quiet, you know, whatever. I think it's a good place to develop habits or ideas or techniques of thinking that will allow you to work through difficult times in the future. And I think it's really good for that. I think SEAL training is tough, but I don't think it is as tough as people want you to think it is. I think I'll just take one mission, the lone survivor stuff. SEAL training is, Hell Week is the hardest part of SEAL training, and it starts on a Sunday, it's over on Friday. We roped in and walked around in those mountains and carried the bodies of our dead friends and watched those Rangers carry them up that side of that mountain. We were out there for 6 days. And people were killing our friends and shooting at us. And man, that makes SEAL training look like a fucking dance,
Yeah.
It's not, it's a curated, dangerous environment. It's not a dangerous environment. It's a curated, dangerous environment. It is dangerous on its own because of the type of environments you're in, but it's all curated, and you have people watching over every single thing you do. And there's safety this and safety that, which is great. And it should be that way for training. But when you're out there hanging it out on your own, that's a whole different kind of feeling. And I think it's, generally speaking, the guys who talk a lot of shit about SEAL training didn't see a lot of combat.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Which, look, SEAL training's hard. I mean, it is. It's really hard, but it doesn't make you a really good fighter. You have to be a fighter to be a really good fighter. It prepares you for sure.
Yeah, I guess it kind of prepares you mentally, right? If you can embrace that, the sucky part of it, you can then deal with the combat side. You can fight through the mental side of, carrying your friends up a hill.
That's the truth too, though, right? Like, you don't get in a gunfight while you're well rested, right?
Right.
Gunfights happen not the opportune time where you get to pick your gun up off the, it's a big deal. And I don't think you can train hard enough. And that's a problem that I've had since I left the military. I've met some cops who have the same kind of mindset, but in my mind, if you're in a job where you or your friends can be killed if you blow it out your ass, you can't train hard enough. And I'm not saying you should ruin your family and your the rest of your professional life, but when I see people who blatantly disregard the seriousness of what can occur if they fuck things up in their job, it's heart-wrenching a little bit,
I deal with recruits at the academy, about 6-8 days a month, and I see that regularly. And every now and then you just have to go up and talk to them and just say, listen, are you really sure you know what you're getting into? Are you really ready for what's about to happen in a few weeks? You're not taking this seriously.
Yeah.
And, I made it by one in my firearms. Building search, whatever. No, it's serious. And there are officers that get killed on their first radio call. First radio call out of the academy, they get killed. There are also officers that get killed on their last radio call after 35 years. That happens. And then you have to understand that everything in between. And some people just don't realize, what they're getting into. And it irks me too. So you're not alone there, Jimmy.
I think there's a common theme there, Jack. And I think a really good professor of mine who happens to be incredibly liberal, and I love him. He's just an incredible guy. He believes in what he believes in, and he stands by it, and he stands up for it. But he has said to me flat out, he goes, Jimmy, the generation that we have now in the United States of America is the most protected group of people in the history of the world. They are so far from any really bad thing happening that they don't believe those things happen. Mm-hmm. And I think he's right. I think, and I say it about my classmates, they're like, in fact, I took a bunch of the NROTC kids to the New Haven police department to do some training with them. And the some of my buddies from the Canine unit were there, just helping with the trainings. About halfway through, and I didn't even think about this because I'm just accustomed to this world, right? About halfway through, one of the sharp kids, he's like, man, Jimmy, I've never been around cops. Like, I've never been around a cop unless I was like in trouble. And I'm like, really? And then I'd had 2 or 3 other kids come up and said the same thing. And I'm like, all right, hey, man, how about we do this? How about we cut a little bit shorter? You guys can have a Q&A with these guys and just, ask them some questions. I didn't realize what I was doing. Man, those kids came undone. Well, how do you balance your family life? Are people mad at you all the time? Like, these kids didn't have a fucking clue. And these are all kids at Yale. Yeah. These are kids that are going to be leaders. I mean, these kids are like valedictorians. Like, these kids are not messing around. And they were That shows you exactly the kind of quality kids they are. They came up to me and said, "Hey, man, I've never talked to a cop before."
Wow, that's cool that they came up to you and said
right?
that. I mean, they're honest.
It really is. There are
Sure.
kids who talk shit, but there are also kids who don't and who understand. And here's a good example. I was asked to bring a couple of classmates to a safety meeting, and one of the young women classmates was in the Parkland school shooting, and the other kid grew up in Brooklyn. Now, these kids, we talk shit about these kids being weak and all that, but when I was growing up, I didn't do active shooter drills in school.
Right.
You know what I mean? I didn't have to do any of that stuff. I'm sure that has an effect on you. At any rate, I brought these kids to this meeting, and somebody in the meeting said, we know that you students don't really like the police. And the kid from Brooklyn was like, that's absolutely not true. There's definitely ways that policing can improve in some places, but no, we understand that we're all in this together. And the former chief of police goes, "Oh, so it's not the students."
That's right.
And it's not.
Oh, yeah.
I'm going with that. Right.
I mean, police aren't invited in anymore. They're being kicked out of schools rapidly,
right.
And I remember as a youngster having police come into the classroom just to have a talk, and say, "Oh, this is what kind of like explaining what their job is." And this is in a small town, but you knew all of them and you had this positive feeling about them because of that. And, that doesn't happen much anymore.
Well, it doesn't, but that's what, I genuinely believe that for whatever fucking reason, they decided to let me into that school. And I've learned so much there about life and the way I thought before I got there. And I feel like it's my job to build these bridges between parts of our society that there are no bridges, that we kind of talk past each other and we don't really see each other as human beings. And I cops, people say horrible. I mean, I'm in Ohio, and one of my favorite friends here is a Canine guy, and he was meeting me for coffee after a night of adventure, chasing kids who put pistols in people's bellies and take their car, tracking them through the woods, and could get shot at or get killed, And he's like, "I'm sitting at the light out here pulling into the restaurant, and there's 4 high school kids on their way to school, and they're all flipping me off." Yeah. I'm like, "Are you serious?" He goes, "Yeah, I can't do anything about it." And I'm like, "But I can't believe that." I mean, even I was an asshole as a kid, but I would never flip off. It's just crazy.
It is.
And I worry about my friends, man, my buddies that are out there doing it. I worry about them. And here's the thing that I worry about, and this is kind of taken off on a tangent too, but a guy who I love actually recently it was his first sending his dog on a real bite. And, when you're in those tactical situations, let me say it this way. When I was in those tactical situations, I didn't worry about if it was right or wrong. I knew in my heart I'm good. But he actually second guessed himself. And that's dangerous. That shit'll get you killed.
Yeah.
And I worry about that culture. I really do.
Oh,
Jack, what do you think about all that?
I worry about it constantly because these people that are getting into law enforcement now are in a whole different world than John and I were. And certainly I was in the 80s. It was a completely different world. You didn't worry about, people with cameras videotaping you, or you didn't worry about if you just did what was right, everything was fine. Now you could do everything right and still end up on the news and still end up in court and still, it's completely different. Second guessing will get you hurt, will get you killed, but I do understand it. I do, because you're not those people that are second guessing themselves. That young officer you're talking about, he watches the news. he's seen cops do things perfect, 100% perfect, and end up in court. How does that happen? Well, it happens. And especially in the canine world, where liability has always been high, now you're scrutinized even more. And you might be thinking, wow, this is clean. I can let this dog go, get him. And as soon as you let go of that collar going, man, I hope I'm right, And I hate that, but it's reality.
As I think back on our career, and Jack can probably attest to this, I feel like for a majority of our career in the field, there was a line in the sand as far as how you reacted to things. And the line in the sand usually was dictated by the suspect. So if the suspect reacted in a way that allowed you to use physical force or lethal force, you did. And that was the only thing you were concerned about. Now, these young kids, it's not just that line in the sand. It's the peripheral things that they have to consider, like Jack talked about as well. What's going to happen to me if I'm by all accounts legally entitled to do what I'm going to do? What's the media going to do to me? What are they going to do to my department, and what are they going to do to my family?
Exactly.
So I feel like the job has become complex in ways that I didn't have to deal with, and it's not something that's easy to deal with. Going back to your career, Jimmy, people are, at this point in the podcast, are probably like, well, what's the tie to aviation? And you've got a really interesting tie in there with aviation. In fact, I don't know you well enough to say this, but my guess is probably one of your favorite things in the world is tied directly to aviation. It's jumping on airplanes.
Yeah.
Can you,
for sure.
Can you talk to us about how that love for jumping started and how you employed that in the military?
I was growing up, in Utah, and there's an army base there called Camp Williams, and I could see occasionally C-130s flying over and guys jumping out of them. I could see the parachutes, and I remember I was probably 3 or 4 the first time I saw it. I'm like, I will damn be doing that. It was pretty funny. Yeah, and I remember my first jump, I was 17, jumped out of the airplane in Fort Benning, and man, I love it. I got to ride in the back of an F-18 once, and that's cool.
Oh.
Pretty wild. And then, most of my career I was on, in helicopters, and I was the TF-160 guys call you a customer. I was a customer of some of the best aviation people in the world, and
Oh yeah,
I'm tied in.
Do you have any idea how many hours you spent in the back of a Chinook or a Black Hawk over the years? Yeah. It's countless, probably.
Yeah, quite a few.
If you look back at your career and kind of the evolution of you as a operator and jumping out of airplanes, I think you look forward and you wrote in your book about how you jumped into Dodger Stadium. As a baseball fan, that'd probably be one of the coolest things I could ever imagine, jumping into a baseball stadium full of people and combining that with aviation in a way. Can you talk about that not that incident, but that event and how that, first of all, how that transpired and then what it was like doing that?
Yeah, it was funny, man, because the airspace over LA is, Jack, you probably could choose the best word. And and we had to get out low. I think we were around 3,500 feet and I remember getting out of the airplane and I could see blimps and helicopters. I was like, God damn, this place is crowded. And it was my first stadium jump, like with fans there. Right. And so I jumped into the stadiums before, but never with 59,000 people screaming. Well, I didn't hear anything. I was so scared. I didn't hear anything. I remember landing because, there's all these rules, like do not land in the infield and fuck up that dirt, and you're like, what? Don't land over it, don't land. And there's wires running from the home plate down first base and the home plate down third base. There's all this shit that can go sideways. So I remember landing and they came right in, and 2 of the guys I was with actually landed in the parking lot. Wow. I didn't make it in. I flew over second base, and I remember looking at that picture of Jackie Robinson on the wall.
That's cool.
Fell, and I was like... And one of my buddies runs up and goes, "Hey, asshole, get your parachute and get off the field. We're on TV time." We run off the field, and we put our parachutes down. They're like, "Hey, they want us up in the owner's box," And I'm like, "This is my first baseball game, right?" So we're up in the owner's box, and like Kenny Mayne, my favorite old sportscaster, used to say, "The finest meats and cheeses," right? Beer and burgers and scallops, and Steve Garvey standing here, and I'm like, wow, I love me some baseball, So I got to buy a ticket, and I'm sitting there going, it was awesome, man.
Was that
really
as part
cool.
of the leapfrogs or separate from that?
Turned out to end up being about 2 years, but I only did a few demonstrations with them. I got hurt pretty bad, and then after I got hurt, I did some more jumping, but they're like, "Hey man, beat it." They kicked me out because I had pretty bad head injury, and people didn't understand the connectivity between head injuries and anger, and it was bad. So it was about 2 years.
What happened on the jump as it pertains to the injury?
So me and another guy were doing what's called a down plane. So both parachutes are flying straight at the ground. And then at the last minute, you kind of brake, you let go, and then you land. It's really cool. It's exciting. Well, we hit the ground still going straight at it. We had a piece of equipment that we were using, and it failed, and we couldn't get it fixed in time, and we just hit the ground. So broke my back, and I was in a coma for a week, and shoulders. And my buddy who saved our ass, he reached up and grabbed the rear risers of his canopy, and it slowed us down, tilted us a little bit. But that's the only reason we lived. We're the only people that's ever landed that and lived, I think. And he broke a bunch of ribs, punctured his lungs, but he's all right.
Wow.
He did good. Wow. And then, it took, I was paralyzed on my right side for a matter of months. It took me a long time to learn to walk again and all that kind of stuff. But what are you going to do?
Yeah.
Get back in the air.
So you talked about the brain injury. I think in the book you referred, it was a TBI that you had as a result of that. Can you talk about how that impacted the rest of your career and led to talk about some aggressive behavior as a result?